Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, here. No, we still have it.
Mom, I can't stand this company. I have to do this. I mean, not only the quarters of the boy, but the 2%.
Well, I figure I'm going to get all this chemistry and biology and that's what I'm going to do. So that's studying.
Because I remember the ones who came with me.
My spectroscope, like, very high.
I don't know whether they use it today.
A lot more electronic imaging. But, I mean, I got a high score on my undergrad. It's better to do science as well. I love it. My there's no time. It's complicated sounds for time, but I think I'm sort of excited. I feel like I've been waiting for this stuff for a long time now, and it's not going to be. It'll all be new to me when I get there. So I'm going to be sort of. I'm sort of excited. I've been putting it off just like anything now.
Does that mean you're more interested in research?
I'm more interested in clinical research that's very you never know, but I think I'll probably step into something that combines music. Maybe just
Because it was open, and then I went in. I learned H1. I was glad each time when I left. At the time when I left, I came back and medical practice.
I probably
Research took a bit of time. It was terribly hard to get money. And a single investigator was pretty hard. So I spent more and more time on grants.
Oh yeah, you retired from clinical.
I'm sorry,
So that was
and that was really, I mean, I just, as well as the hospital and all those kinds of things.
Good afternoon. This is not the beginning, but before the beginning. And I've been asked to introduce myself so that you'll know why I'm here on such an auspicious occasion when we have so many inspiring panelists ahead of us. But we wanted to warm up and connect the audience a little bit. And my name is Tim Mitchell. I've spent 9 years doing theater in prisons, mostly with prisoners and former prisoners. And I do a kind of interactive community-based theater technique. What we're going to do today with the audience is very, very simple. You've all done it before. It involves a handshake, but there's a little twist to it. So here's how it's going to go. I'm going to ask everybody here to stand up for just a moment. Would you do that? Okay, excellent. Now I'm going to ask you, just listen for all the instructions first. I'm going to ask you to shake your neighbor's hand. But when you do that, I'm going to ask you not to let go of that hand until you get someone else's hand. So, for example, if I shake Professor Torres's hand, I'm not going to let go until I shake someone else's hand. Then I can let go and try to shake someone else's hand. Okay? And that's all there is to it. It's a bit of an obstacle course, so have a little fun with it. So please begin.
I just need to correct something about my name, which is that there's no S on the Daniel. Okay, it's Beverly Daniel here.
Thank you. I was wondering that. Okay.
Don't forget, hang on until you get somebody else. You might have a little negotiating to do. See if you can meet everybody here.
Ran out of hands? No, I think your hand. Okay. Well, I'm stuck on your hand. Uh-oh. I got stuck.
Thanks very much. And without further ado, Professor Carter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon on our for this fine symposium and our first panel today, which is entitled Moving Beyond Affirmative Action, Rethinking the Mission of Higher Education. I eagerly anticipate the dialogue and discussion that will emerge among our panelists as well as between the panelists and you, our audience. I want to make a few words of commentary before I turn the microphone over to our distinguished panelists. First, let me just say to you that as the description of the panel says in the program, we're not here today to debate the pros and cons of affirmative action, but rather we're here to explore new ideas and alternatives that will facilitate praxis or action with regard to ensuring that our nation's institutions of higher education truly reflect its population's composition. Now, given the findings and the data from the latest figures of the 2000 census, increasingly the citizenry comprises groups of individuals identified as peoples of color. Yet many of the institutions that play critical roles in the distributions of academic, economic, political, and social goods do not reflect the actual makeup of our society. And many of us in this space today are about the business of education, a process through which the higher attainment of credentials increases the probability of chances for individual socioeconomic outcomes as well as their well-being. But let's be frank here. We're not talking about just any form of education. Our stratified society supports different tiers of educational institutions, and the most elite institutions are provided with resources and supports that prepare their students to become some of the most powerful and key players in various political, economic, and social spheres. Now, we know from observation and empirical evidence who is most likely to be the student beneficiaries of these institutions, as well as the employee beneficiaries. And since higher education is a significant determinant of one's placement in society, many have fought for decades to ensure that the distribution of these educational resources is more representative of those who sustain this nation as citizens, as workers, as parents, as producers, etc. Since the demand for attendance at these educational institutions outpaces the supply of seats, how do we fairly and equitably choose? That is probably the most pressing question before us today. But before we can sufficiently address these questions, we have to take into account some history and the injurious effects of legalized and institutionalized forms of past racial, ethnic, and economic oppression in these United States of America that have put African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and various Latino ethnic groups at a disadvantage. The unfortunate social conditions emerging from the gross politics of race and ethnicity and economic greed have become the, quote, cave of poisonous gases that have threatened the lives of many, as Professors Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres' book, The Miner's Canary, posits. And without effective solutions to deal with these dangerous and life-altering conditions of the cave, we will continue to jeopardize the lives of many, quote, canaries. So I'm happy to be here today to have a discussion with you and with our fine panelists to talk about how we can be able to save lives, canaries, and I'm privileged and honored to introduce to you our speakers for the day. There are several questions that we hope to address. And one of those main kind of broad questions is that given the possibility of kind of progressive legal tactics or outcomes, where do we go from here in terms of maintaining our commitment to diversified student bodies and higher educational institutions? And practically speaking, how do we galvanize the attention of various racial and ethnic groups so that diversity is simply not viewed as a minority issue? That's one of the questions. These are questions that I hope our panelists will address, in addition to several others. How we intend to operate is to first have each panelist speak to you for about 10 minutes, and then they will respond to one another. And then we hope to have a very fruitful discussion with you. There are microphones positioned strategically throughout the forum here this evening, and you certainly can line up there and to ask questions, and we hope to have at least 30 minutes of discussion. Before we turn it over to you, though, as the questioners of our panelists, I'd like to introduce these fine women. We have with us, to my right first, Ms. Carolyn Wong. Carolyn is the college coordinator with the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action by Any Means Necessary, BAM, at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Carolyn has been instrumental in recruiting and mentoring the 41 named student interveners in the Grutter versus Bollinger case. To her left, we have Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, the acting president of Mount Holyoke College, a clinical psychologist, and a professor of psychology and education. She's also the author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And last, but certainly not least, to her left, we have Professor Lonnie Guinier, the Bennett Bosky Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School, and also the co-author of The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, and Transforming Democracy. I mean, certainly there are a number of other long lists of accolades and things that I can mention about her, but I don't want to be repetitive. I'm very pleased to be here on the stage with all three of you, and I will turn it over to you now, Professor Guinier. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Prudence, and thank you all for coming today. I want to talk briefly about ways in which we might answer one of the questions that Prudence posited, and that is how can we make issues of diversity of concern to students of all colors, not just students who are Black or Latino or Asian. And Gerald Torres and I have written a book that tries to lay out a framework for thinking about just these issues by thinking about the metaphor of the miner's canary. And I want to first explain that metaphor and then show how if we think about issues relating to race as issues relating to the canary in the mines, that we may be able to figure out, at least begin to conceptualize and brainstorm ways to answer Prudence's question. The miners used to take a canary into the mines to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was too toxic for the miners. And the canary had a more fragile respiratory system which would give way, signaling a problem with the atmosphere in the mines. And the argument that Gerald and I are making is that the experience of people of color in this society is the experience of the canary in the mines. And that problems often converge, collect, are associated with people of color. Perhaps I should make an announcement that all people should turn off their cell phones if they haven't done that already. Problems that converge around people of color are associated with people of color, and in this society, we then locate those problems as if they are problems of people of color. And we then conclude that the solution must be to fix the canary, to outfit the canary, as Gerald once said, with a little pint-sized gas mask so that it can withstand this toxic atmosphere. And what we're trying to do is to move from thinking about fixing the canary to fixing the atmosphere in the mines, and using the experience of the canary as a diagnostic tool, as a way of alerting us to the fact that there is a problem. And the very visibility of that problem comes to our attention because it collects around race. So we want to start with race as a lens, as a diagnostic tool, but we want to use race to try to move to issues of class, to issues of gender, to issues of sexuality, to issues that affect not only people of color, but working class and poor whites as well. Access to higher education is a good example of the way in which problems that seem to converge around people of color are actually signals of dysfunction in the minds, not simply problems that are located in the canary. And I want to run through three different examples of how this may be true, starting with Texas, going to the University of Michigan, and then ending in California. Each of these examples that I'm about to talk with you today to describe are examples involving institutions of public education, higher education that is publicly subsidized. But I don't think that they are limited to the experience of public institutions, and I know that Beverly Tatum will talk about some of these problems in the context of Mount Holyoke, which is a private institution. I think the case is very easy to make, however, in the context of public institutions, and so that's why I want to start with the easy case, just to demonstrate that this is about moving from the margin of the conversation into the settled core of fundamental assumptions that we have made about access to higher education, and even underneath that assumption, who should and who deserves to go to institutions of higher education, assumptions about merit, right? So this requires that we talk about merit and not just talk about diversity, and I will suggest that issues of merit and diversity are integrally related. So let me start with Texas and the experience of blacks and Latinos in trying to respond to a federal court decision that abolished affirmative action at the University of Texas. Now, Cheryl Hopwood had been the plaintiff in this case. She brought a case claiming that 63 out of 92 black and Latino students had been admitted to the University of Texas Law School with lower Texas index scores than she had. She was a white working class woman. She was a single mom. She was raising a child with disabilities. And she alleged that the fact that these black and Latino students were admitted showed that they were being given a racial preference because they were less qualified than she was. Turns out at the same time that she was rejected, 140 white students were admitted to the University of Texas Law School with lower Texas index scores than Cheryl Hopwood. And nobody talked about the 140 white students who were admitted. They focused only on the students of color. Part of the reason they focused on the students of color is because race is a visible category in this society, and we notice what is happening to students of color. We don't notice often what is also happening to white students because we don't think about white students in terms of race, and we don't notice, we assume that what's happening to them is just normal, and we take it for granted. Turns out, however, that there was a very serious class differential in terms of the white students who were getting admitted to the University of Texas Law School that was invisible. So the fact that the black and Latino students were coming in with lower Texas index scores, and primarily that meant lower LSATs, that was visible. But what the University of Texas was doing that was invisible is that they were using an equation that included in everyone's admission file not only their own LSAT and not only their own GPA, but the median LSAT of all of the students who had taken the test at the college from which they were graduating. Now, it turns out that these tests have a very strong relationship to parental income. In fact, they have a stronger relationship to parental income than they do to first-year law school grades. If you know someone's LSAT, you are better able to predict even their grandparents' socioeconomic status than you are to predict their first-year law school grades. Nationwide, the LSAT is about 9% better than random in predicting first-year law school grades. And yet we use this test as if it is a proxy for merit, and we don't question why certain people are doing well on this test. What we focus on are the people who are not doing as well, even though there's a serious question whether this test is a functional predictor of who should get into law school. There are serious questions unless you believe that people who are somehow wealthier, people who are already privileged, have a better claim on our public resources than the rest of us. Now, a group of Black and Latino professors and activists and legislators and lawyers got together once the Fifth Circuit had ruled in favor of Cheryl Hopwood and decided that they were not going to let this decision stand in the way of diversity at the University of Texas, both the undergraduate school and also Texas A&M, which both of those are the two flagship schools. And they started to investigate aspects of this, what I call the testocracy, right? They started to investigate the fact that the LSAT and the SAT were not particularly good predictors of performance in school. And they had this racial effect, but it also turns out they have this class effect. And they discovered that of the 1,500 high schools in Texas, 150 of those high schools were dominating the freshman class at the University of Texas in Austin. That meaning 10% of the high schools were providing 75% of the freshmen at the University of Texas in Austin. And those 150 high schools were the suburban high schools in Austin and Dallas and Houston, as well as some of the independent schools. And the students who were at those schools tended to be more affluent. They also found out that grades in high school are a better predictor of first-year college performance than the SAT. So if you're interested just in first-year college performance, then you might as well use high school grades rather than the SAT. And they came up with a plan, the 10% plan, that anybody in the top 10% of their high school graduating class should automatically be eligible for admission to one of the two flagship schools. They actually got this bill passed by the Texas legislature, signed by Governor George Bush. It passed by one vote. And that one vote came from a Republican legislator who represented a district in rural West Texas, because he discovered that the SAT, which was keeping out blacks and Latinos, was also keeping out his working class and poor white constituents. And he discovered that not a single one of his constituents had been admitted to the University of Texas in Austin for the past 10 or 15 years. So this is the paradigm of moving from race to class, but you have to start with race because race helps make visible problems with the atmosphere in the minds. We have a language and a vocabulary for talking about race. We don't have a language and vocabulary for talking about class. In addition, because of the experience of being racialized in this society, many of the people who are willing to take risks and willing to mobilize to do something about being excluded are the people of color. And therefore, it was no accident that the initiative for changing the way in which Texas was admitting all of its students came from a group that was originally black and Latino. So this is what we are calling political race, that race is not just about your cultural identity or what you look like, that race is also a political position that you can take vis-a-vis power in this society. And we are talking about political race as a way of trying to understand race differently so that we are not locked into simple identity categories, although we respect identity formations, because your identity as a person of color often gives you a sense that your fate is linked to other people, that you are not alone. And part of the reason that's such a critical factor is understanding that when you are excluded or when things happen, that it is happening as part of a system that is affecting not only you, and therefore in order to change it, you have to join with other people and act collectively to make that change. Now let me go quickly to two other examples. The second example is University of Michigan, where as a result of efforts to challenge their use of affirmative action, a group of researchers did a study looking at who, and this is now at the law school, University of Michigan, but still a public institution, looking at who does well consistent with the mission of that institution after they graduate. They decided that the issue is not just who does well first year in law school or who does well as students in law school, but who actually succeeds in life. And they named three aspects of their mission that they thought were important: career satisfaction, financial satisfaction, and contribution to the community. And it was really important for them that they train esteemed practitioners who would become leaders in their community. They then looked, after doing surveys of their graduates over a 30-year period, at the entry-level credentials of those same graduates. And they discovered that the students with the highest entry-level credentials, including the students with the highest LSATs, were no more likely to do well as lawyers. They were no more likely to make more money. In fact, everybody who graduated from the University of Michigan Law School basically made a very comfortable living. They were less likely to be satisfied with their careers. Those with the highest entry-level credentials were less likely to be satisfied with their careers. This was not a statistically significant finding except for the group between 1980 and 1989. But that was something that they discovered. There was, in other words, no relationship between career satisfaction and your entry-level credentials, such that it would explain why higher entry-level credentials should be preferred, meaning traditional credentials. They found a relationship between those with the highest credentials coming in and leadership in the community, a negative relationship. The higher your LSAT, the less likely you were to be a leader in the community. You were less likely to mentor younger attorneys. You were less likely to sit on community boards. You were less likely to do pro bono work. The group with the highest level of community leadership were the Black and Latino students who had been admitted pursuant to affirmative action. This says to me that we have to start looking at affirmative action differently, again, as the canary in the mines, as a window on the way in which all institutions should begin to think about their admissions practices. That Michigan was obviously doing something right in the way in which it was admitting students of color, and it needed to learn from what it was doing in terms of admitting the students of color to begin to admit all of its students using the same kind of whole person analysis. And that is what we call confirmative action, confirming the lessons of affirmative action and applying it to the way in which the school is admitting everyone. Moving from the margin of the debate around diversity to the settled core of institutional decision making. The last example that I want to give you is about California. California also had a fight about affirmative action. It was a big fight. It was a referendum, Proposition 209. And again, the issue was to locate the problem in the canary and to argue that students of color, particularly Black and Latino students, were somehow monopolizing access to the institutions of higher education, and that they were less qualified than other students, and less qualified, again, measured by their SAT scores. Turns out, however, that Black and Latino students were not monopolizing access to institutions of higher education in California. For every one Black student who was at a four-year state college, there were 5 in prison. For every one Latino student who was at a four-year state college, there were 3 in prison. And if we had looked at the Canary and tracked what was happening to the Canary, we would see that the resources that should have been going to institutions of higher education were actually following those Canaries not to college but to jail. And that there had been a shift in resources that started in 1984 that moved state money away from funding institutions of higher education to funding prisons. In 1984, California spent 2.5 times as much on higher education as prison. Over the next decade, it built 16 new prisons and only 1 new institution of higher education. During that period, they laid off 8,000 of the staff and administrators in colleges and hired 25,000 people in the prison system. They started paying prison guards. First-year college professor was making $41,000 a year. A prison guard was making $51,000 a year. So there was a shift in resources, but that was invisible because we were focused on the Canary as if the Canary was the problem. And we are saying that we do need to look at the Canary because it is making visible a problem, not with the Canary, but with the atmosphere in the mind. So that we're starting with race, but we are tracking race and its relationship to power to begin to understand the way in which resources are being distributed that not only adversely affect people of color, but also adversely affect working class and poor whites. And the bottom line is after 209 was passed and affirmative action was eliminated, exactly what you might have expected, having listened to what I said about Texas, happened in California. And that is because of the emphasis on the SAT, the financial status of the students who were going to these schools was skewed compared to the demographics of the state of California. So at the University of California, Berkeley, in 1997, right? So this is a year after 209 is passed. 42% of the white freshmen came from families with incomes over $100,000 a year. 42% of the white freshmen in 1997 at the University of California, Berkeley came from families with incomes over $100,000 a year. So again, this is a story about watching the Canary, not to fix the Canary, but to fix the atmosphere in the minds to benefit people of color, but also to begin to rethink the way in which we distribute opportunity so that it also benefits poor and working class whites. Thank you.
Great.
Shall I just presenting?
Well, this is a wonderful introduction to begin talking about Mount Holyoke in some ways as a case example of some of the ideas that have just been articulated. It will be important for me to say that Mount Holyoke is the oldest women's college in the United States, oldest continuing women's college in the United States, founded in 1837, and was clearly founded with the intent of preparing women for leadership and public service. And that continues to be a major thrust of our institutional mission. And in thinking about this, we have, and I should say we are a private institution of about 2,000 students. And in that context, we have a very different admissions process than certainly large public universities. We certainly do see the diversity of our student body as an essential part of our educational environment. And in fact, 1 in 3 students at Mount Holyoke is either a US student of color or an international student, many of whom are women of color. So it is a very diverse environment and has always been. In fact, I think Mount Holyoke is probably has one of the largest international student populations of a school of its size, and that in part has to do with the legacy of what we call the Mary Lyon legacy of educating teachers and missionaries who went out to different parts of the world and set up mini Mount Holyokes and various other places, and so we've always had a fairly high international student population, but have also been very proactively recruiting US students of color as well. But I have to say one of the things that we have been challenged by is our location, and also, which is a small town in western Massachusetts, South Hadley, Massachusetts, and also by the fact that we are still a women's college, and only about, at this point, 3% of college-age attending students indicate a desire to attend a single-sex institution. So it does make for a challenging recruitment environment. And in that context, we work hard to, as I said, create a diverse student body, and yet several years ago we began to think about how we could be more proactive and more effective in terms of attracting particularly U.S. students of color. And that discussion led to, and it was not, because we are a private institution, it was not the result of lawsuits or other pressures, though of course this is a question throughout higher education in terms of the impact of the various legal challenges to affirmative action and what they will be, not only in the public sector, but in the private sector. But certainly in our own situation, we were thinking about what were some of the barriers to application for the students we hope to attract. And that discussion led us to think about the role that the SATs were playing in the application process in terms of discouraging students who we might want to apply, who would look us up in their, guide, Princeton's Guide to Colleges or whatever, and say, I can't go to this school because my SATs may not be in that particular range, when in fact we put very little emphasis on the SATs in the application process. We have a very, as I said, we put a lot of emphasis on the development of women's leadership, and we're interested in students as whole people in terms of their extracurricular activities, in terms of their community involvements, in terms of the leadership potential they've demonstrated in high school. And we obviously are also, of course, interested in their academic performance and want to foster their intellectual and personal growth at the college. But in this context, for example, to just give you a sense of what the application process entails, all applicants to Mount Holyoke are encouraged to have an interview. They also have to submit writing statements. And of course, all colleges ask for the essays and that kind of thing. We also ask for a graded assignment from their high school so that we not only get to see their writing, but we also have some sense of what the standard of grading has been at the institution. So we have some sense of the quality and rigor of their educational experience. We, as I said, are also interested in things like motivation, intellectual curiosity, creativity, et cetera. Some of the things that are more intangible and not easily measured by things like the SAT. So after much discussion in our community among the faculty, and there is a committee on our campus to look at admissions and financial aid policies, that faculty governance committee made a recommendation that Mount Holyoke should drop its SAT requirement. And in fact, in the fall or the spring, actually, of 2001, that decision was made to make SATs optional. So those students who want to submit them can, but they don't have to. And that has proven to be a very positive decision. It's been very interesting for us to, it's been very positive in that it has increased the applicant pool. We saw the applications of students of color increase about 40%. Following that decision. What's interesting about that is, however, that this admission cycle, the fall of 2001, is the first year of the students entering who were admitted under the SAT optional. But in the first year of the application of this new policy, we found that most students still chose to submit their SATs. Only about 24% of our applicant pool took advantage of the SAT optional policy. But, and I should say that we are engaged in a 5-year study of the effects of this policy in terms of looking at who comes, what their experience is in the college, looking at the performance of non-submitters versus submitters, as we call them. But because we are engaged in this research, we do find out what the SAT scores are of the non-submitters. So I should just simply say that after a student has been accepted, you get data from the Educational Testing Service that allows you to know what their SAT scores were, even though that information was not factored in or even looked at during the admissions process. And because we have access to that information, one of the things that we now know is that the academic profiles of those students who submitted and those who didn't submit are very similar. So we are happy to know that the students who are coming in under this process are in fact very much like the students we were admitting when we were requiring SATs. What is interesting about them, though, and I think this is a good reason, and one of the factors in our decision to drop the SAT, was that Those students who choose not to submit their SATs are overperforming, I put that in quotes, in terms of when we look at their high school grades are higher than their SAT scores would suggest they would be. So again, this would suggest that the SAT had not adequately measured, in their case, what their academic potential was. So again, it reinforces, from our point of view, the wisdom in dropping the SAT. But there's another reason why we made a decision to drop the SAT, and it wasn't only because we thought it would make our institution more attractive to some students who might see it as beyond their reach. We also felt that we were increasingly seeing students invest time and energy into SAT preparation to artificially inflate their scores, and at the expense of the other things that we want our applicants to be engaged in terms of leadership development, in terms of community service, that it really seemed to be playing an increasingly important role in the lives of high school students for what we felt was a minimal gain from our point of view in terms of our assessment of those students. And we also felt, as has been pointed out in Professor Guinier's comments, that it clearly advantaged those students who had the resources to take those prep courses, and also, as has already been pointed out, highly correlates with family income more than anything else, much like the LSAT does. So that was, as I said, there was much discussion about it, but I have to say, in the end, I could describe this as a fairly non-controversial issue in the context of the Mount Holyoke culture and the values as espoused in our mission. And we are a pretty mission-driven institution. So we have made this decision, and we like to think of ourselves as a leader among other institutions. We were talking about it before UC Berkeley was, and we are certainly pleased with this decision, though, as I said, we are engaged in a 5-year research project to assess its impact in terms of overall student performance. But in that context, I'd like to talk not only about that decision to abandon the SAT, but also to talk then about what alternative strategies are in place in terms of identifying the kinds of students we hope to come to our institution, and then also our strategy for responding to their needs once they're on the campus. And so I brought with me a brochure, and somewhere in the room I know that there are some handouts, our table with materials, and there certainly aren't 100 of these, but I just will wave it around for those of you who can see from the front. It says on the front, "Take the Lead, a leadership program for high school women who want to change the world." Because, again, our focus is the development of women's leadership, we have implemented, we're now in the 3rd year of this program, an early identification strategy where we invite guidance counselors from around the country and other community organizations, as well as Mount Holyoke alums, to nominate sophomores who they see as having leadership potential based on their community activities, the kinds of things that they've been involved in their school or home community. And we receive those nominations, and anyone who has been nominated is sent an application for the Take the Lead program. When they then write an essay, they apply, but one piece of their essay is to identify a community action plan that they are interested in working on, or perhaps already have been working on. Those, in the last year, we had about 700 applications. Of that group of 700, 35 young women were accepted, and they were invited to come to the campus during the fall of their junior year to spend a weekend where they were paired with Mount Holyoke students, upper-class Mount Holyoke students, to work on these action plans, to basically participate in workshops around leadership development, workshops like how to work with the media, how to communicate your ideas to other people, to really develop this action plan, and then go back to their community, work on it. Those later in the year were invited to submit the results of their project to the college for review, and some small number of them get a cash prize for their event. But what this has allowed us to do is to very early on identify the kinds of students who have the kinds of personal qualities we are interested in, and to bring them to the campus so that they can experience what it might be like to be at a women's college and connect with women students who will be role models for them, and it has been very successful so far. This academic year actually represents the first group of Take the Lead graduates who are old enough now to be applying to college, and in fact, a significant number of the students who visited us as juniors at the Take the Lead program have in fact applied and been admitted to Mount Holyoke for the coming year. So we see this as a useful strategy and something that we are excited about, and perhaps a model for other places to begin to think about ways of identifying young women or men, as the case may be if you're at a co-ed institution. But once we get them to our campus, we have to think about how to create an environment that truly allows students to take full advantage of the diversity that is there. One of the things that I think the Michigan case has done, and the work that the Department of Psychology, led by Pat Gurin and others at the University of Michigan did, was talk about the educational benefit of learning in diverse environments. We certainly recognize that and think it's important, and we do have, as I've already said, a very diverse group of students, but one of the things that we know is that just because they're all in the same place doesn't mean they're necessarily engaged with one another. And that one of the things that we are trying to do is to create a climate of engagement, a climate of academic engagement, which means that students are fully engaged in the academic resources and opportunities that the college has to offer. But also, we are interested in creating a climate of engagement where students are fully engaged with each other in terms of learning from the diversity that is present. And I have been describing our strategy as what we refer to as the ABCs. The A stands for affirming identity, the B stands for building community, and the C stands for cultivating leadership. And the A, affirming identity, speaks to the fact that the college years are important. The college years do represent an important time in terms of identity development. What you hope to do, what you plan to major in, who you want to interact with, even your choice of college in some degree is a reflection of who you think you are in the world and what you hope to be. And recognizing that, it's important, it seems to me, to create an environment where everyone sees themselves positively reflected in the environment, that's an important part of affirming identity. The example I often use is imagining, for example, a photograph being taken. If I had a camera and was taking a picture of all of you and sent you a copy of that photograph, the first thing you would do when you received it would be to look for yourself in the picture. You know, everyone does that. And if we think of the college environment as like a giant photograph, you look for yourself in the picture. And to the extent that you see yourself there, you feel included and part of the environment in positive ways. To the extent that you see yourself missing from the picture, you wonder what's wrong with that picture. Or you may start, if you have the experience repeatedly, you may start to wonder what's wrong with me. You know, don't I photograph? You know, why is it that I am never represented in this context? So thinking inclusively is an important part of affirming identity. We also, however, and there are a variety of ways to do that, and perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about what some of those concrete strategies are. But we also want to talk about the fact that it is necessary to build community. If we are bringing students, as we do, from all over the United States and many countries around the world, we want to create a sense of shared community as Mount Holyoke students. And most institutions want that. And you hear many people talking about the importance of community and what that means on the college campus. And in order to do that, you have to create a sense of shared connection. But it's very hard to build community unless people feel that they are indeed going to be included in that community. So affirming identity and building community are not in conflict, but really are complementary to one another. It's really hard to do one without doing the other. The C in this triad is cultivating leadership. And cultivating leadership really speaks to the fact that, as I've already said, it's part of our mission, but in order to be an effective leader in the 21st century, you need to be able to interact effectively with people different from yourself. And if you have come to college without that experience, and certainly most US students do, come to college without those skills in place because they've been living in residentially segregated environments. And for most of our students, our campus environment is the most diverse residential community they've been a part of than their previous experience. So it means that they're in a new situation, being asked to interact with people and perspectives that they may not have encountered before, and how are they going to be able to do that effectively? One of the things that we know is that students avoid. And so we have to think strategically about how we create learning opportunities that really foster that kind of critical dialogue and engagement, and that is part of what we are trying to be very intentional about. We have had the good fortune of having funds from the Mellon Foundation to do an assessment of the ABCs on our campus and what the impact of them, of the practices associated with them have been. And we have essentially been collecting baseline data. And as part of that baseline data, we have reviewed the academic records of students from the last 15 years, over 7,000 records in terms of looking at GPA and how many students were involved in independent research or honors projects or other kinds of things that we consider to be important manifestations of the academic program, but also interviewing alums, again, randomly selected, very diverse group of alums, to talk with them about what they felt they gained from their experience in terms of their own sense of identity, their own sense of connection and community, their own sense of confidence in the skills that they gained. And one of the things that we have determined is that we, like other institutions, have some work to do, that there are gaps as we racially disaggregate along racial and ethnic lines, that there are gaps in academic performance, in satisfaction with the experience, and I think this is probably the most important of the three, with what I have referred to as the engagement gap. That in fact, we find that white students are graduating without fully engaging with the diversity of the community, or at least in the past they have. And that students of color are more likely to be fully engaged in community service and diverse learning opportunities, and that they value them differently. And that I think it's important to focus on that engagement gap in some ways to create a more positive learning environment for all students in the classroom, which will have impact on what we might refer to as the academic achievement gap or the satisfaction gap. So I'm sure that there will be lots of opportunity, lots of questions perhaps about some of the things that we're doing, but that gives you kind of an overall perspective on both how we are trying to democratize the application process and also create a more inclusive environment and a more academically engaged environment for all of our students. Thank you.
I was one of the people who pulled together the student intervention at the University of Michigan affirmative action case, and obviously we are defending affirmative action. That's kind of our starting point, and we at the time didn't know that our case was going to be the one to most likely go to the Supreme Court and be the determining case on affirmative action and integration in higher education at the time, and it's become much more clear now because our case now, we're waiting for a decision from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and after that we are now likely to go to the Supreme Court. And I guess I'm going to preface what I'm saying by something that John Hope Franklin said in the courtroom when he testified for us, and he said that there were two most important things he's ever done with his life. One was to do research for the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that case. And the second was to testify in our case for us in the University of Michigan affirmative action case. And he said it's because there are moments in history that are turning point moments that are difficult to recognize when you're part of it at the moment, but if you take a step back, or like history does, go forwards, you later on see, okay, that was the moment that everything changed. That was the pivotal moment. And he said that that was what the civil rights movement was, and what he learned from that, that this is that kind of turning point moment now, and that we have to make a fight now, and that if we make the fight now, we can determine the course of the next period of history. And if we don't make the fight, this history can move backwards. There have been moments of progress, and there have been moments of regression, and that this is a moment like that, and it does us well. He was speaking in the courtroom to us, to the students, we had a packed courtroom of people saying, okay, you have to recognize this moment as that kind of turning point moment and do everything you can now to try to determine the course of history, because 15 years later, this is going to be a chapter in a history book, but what that chapter isn't written yet. What that chapter contains can either be a period of regression or it can be a period of progress, and what you do now is going to determine that. And that's really our starting point as the kind of the student interveners in the University of Michigan affirmative action case. We think that we have to build a new militant integrated civil rights movement, both to defend affirmative action and also really try to turn the tide, the direction of everything that's happening now. And the organization that I'm part of is the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action and Integration and Fight for Equality by Any Means Necessary. And I'll start with the kind of three premises that we basically have in building both the legal intervention and the new civil rights movement that we're trying to build and lead and draw other leaders forward in. And I guess we started by saying we had to tell the truth about affirmative action. And second, that we had to build a movement that was independent, and that every struggle we fought had to be independent of the university administrations, of the Democrats, and obviously of the Republicans, if we were going to be able to build a fight that was actually going to be strong enough to win. And third, that we had to build a leadership that was based on youth, in part, obviously, because the old guard of the leadership of the last civil rights movement, if they had fought, we would not be in the position that we are in now. And in part, we need the dynamism and the optimism and the determination of youth who are not satisfied with the conditions now to be in the front line of the movement if we are going to be able to move forward. And first, the question of telling the truth about affirmative action. The current defense that's used both by the University of Michigan, but it's the kind of current defense used by pretty much every defense of affirmative action. It's the legal standard is a Bakke defense. It's that educational diversity that diversity is good for education, and that's kind of the objective, which is true, but it's like telling part of the story. It's not the whole thing. To us, the fight that we're engaged in is a fight for equality. It's a fight for integration. It's a fight for real access and real opportunity. It's not just a diversity as tokenism. It's saying, no, there's this society, everything about who you are will determine your opportunities from here on out. And in part, what we're saying is we didn't ask for the attack on affirmative action. And nobody did, but now that it's here, in part, we see it as an opportunity to use it as a springboard to really attack everything about the inequality in this society. And in part, because that's our defense, we've been able to draw forward high school students from Oakland, California, in the kind of Berkeley movement to defend affirmative action, in Detroit high school students who never thought about going to college, but are like, no, the conditions that we go to school in are really terrible and are completely unacceptable. And it's the kind of thing, because our movement is saying, no, we're fighting for equality and integration, and that's the basis, and everything, the kind of status quo that everybody assumes that inner city minority schools are going to be, the resources are going to be inferior. If you're a woman, chances are you're going to be raped or know somebody who was raped at some point in your life. You could have an eating disorder. Like any of the set of things that we assume as kind of taken for granted, we're saying, no, we don't assume these things anymore, and we really think that all of this has to change. And in part, the movement that we're building based on the case that we've been able to put forward at the University of Michigan is really a kind of stepping stone to fighting through broader issues. And in part, what we have, our defense is different than the universities. We are co-defendants with them, which means we're a formal party to the suit, but their case is a First Amendment defense. It's a kind of, we have the right to use diversity as one of the means for our admissions. Our case is essentially integration itself is a compelling state interest. It is something that the society should strive towards. And as the interveners, we had an opportunity to have a platform to speak from to the world, really to the whole United States of America, but to the world about what we were fighting through. And so our first witness, who actually spoke on a panel like this in New York, Erica Dowdell, talked about, she was a Detroit high school student now at U of M, talked about the conditions of the Detroit public schools. And the judge, we had a courtroom filled with students, and the judge tried to say her testimony was irrelevant to the question of affirmative action because it wasn't about diversity. And the courtroom was like, how can you not have the conditions of unequal education as part of this case? And that was what she talked about. And we were able to really bring that out as not just a kind of, oh, this is how terrible it is, but this is what it is, and we're making a fight around it. And we had Gary Orfield, who's obviously a professor here, talked about the question of segregation, and I think made clear to everybody there, especially for the Detroit high school students, that the conditions in Detroit are not just Detroit, that this is a question of racism and institutionalized racism in this society that's through and through, and really drew that question out in a way that wasn't just a kind of academic coming to testify in the court, but what we were able to do, because it was a packed courtroom and a very kind of determined crowd, was when he got up to testify, one of the lawyers from the Center for Individual Rights, who's the law firm suing the University of Michigan, and they're also the law firm that was behind the University of Texas case, and they're also a law firm that was part of the attack on affirmative action in California. This is a kind of very well-organized and concerted attack. He started by saying, well, you know, I'm going to start by going backwards. And Professor Orfield said, well, isn't that what you're trying to do in general in society? And everybody, was really woke up, but it was clear that this is not just an academic issue that, you can talk about, and I'll tell you, kind of what I've studied and what I've learned, but no, this is a real struggle, and there are real sides, and there is going to be a real resolution that is going to determine the quality of our lives, and we are in for a real fight here, and we are determined to fight and win. And another expert who testified talked about the standardized tests, and we had several who talked about both the class bias. Obviously, like Professor Guinier said, if you have money, that will determine both a lot about your scores, but also if you can take a test prep course and boost your score. It's not about, you're not smarter 6 months later, you're just a little bit poorer, and probably for the people who take them, not much, but you obviously get a better score. About the bias and racism and sexism that's inherent in the test, from both the test questions that they pick and how they construct the test year after year, modeling them on who did well at what questions, which obviously disadvantages Black and minority students and women who don't do well on a certain set of questions, and because of that, those questions are consistently the ones that are put in. I know this is not completely clear, but there's a kind of a consistency that there must be to the test, which means if minority students don't do well in general, that's going to be replicated the next year. And then Professor Claude Steele's work from California on the kind of the effect of both the racism in the test and the anxiety that the top scoring and best Black students, when you take a test in which you're told that this is going to determine, something about your intelligence level, do very poorly. If they're told this is something that's just a kind of how you solve problems, do as well as white students. Obviously, that is not, and that is, everyone knows the SAT is that. I mean, I heard something on the radio where they asked all these celebrities and stars to say their SAT scores, and none of them would, because everybody feels that it's like a, mark of something on them, and that's not, it doesn't measure who you are, what your intelligence is, or any of it. And we were able to use, through our case, the formal case that we put on, to really expose. We had, one other witness talked about, she went to one of the Massachusetts sister schools, and she's a Latina student, working class student from Chicago, and talked about the racism and the class bias and her experience at that school, and how much she had to fight just to even get herself to stay there, and how much that impacts when you're applying to graduate schools and trying to move on from there. Everything about your GPA and your test scores are determined by the climate of racism on these campuses. And I know I heard from a student here that obviously at the law school, the kind of level of, that students feel like they can say, or people feel like they can say such openly racist things just defending an affirmative action policy doesn't change the climate on these campuses. And in part, we have to build a new movement to turn all of that around. And I'll just say something on the movement that we've built, obviously, I'm sure there are student organizers and activists in here, and part of what we've done has been the kind of, obviously, the standard, you hold an educational forum. We've talked about what affirmative action is. We've educated people about what it was. We've had the expert witnesses come in, talk about it, and we've had rallies, obviously, defending affirmative action, and we've done a petition campaign that we've used to kind of engage with as many students and as many people as we could. When people, you ask people to sign a petition and they'll say, well, I don't support affirmative action. And some people don't want to get into a conversation, but some people do have questions. And it's given us a chance to really, kind of fight through and get a sense of where people really stand. But we've also been able to take up at the University of Michigan several campaigns that I think in part have made people feel like, okay, integration is possible, an integrated fight against racism is possible, and we can actually change things and win. And I'll just kind of briefly outline two of them. One of them was a campaign against a racist policy of our student union, and that was against Black and Latino parties that were held there. And the policy, I think, is similar to what's at other campuses, although I'm not sure about here, where the students had to wear wristbands labeling them as party goers, which was not true of white student parties. There were triple the amount of police, including having police on the actual dance floor of the party. They would cut off ticket sales early frequently if they kind of felt nervous and felt like there were too many Black students coming, flocking around the union in the front of the union. They prematurely cut off ticket sales. At the end of the party, the police have locked arms and have advanced on the students as if you were at a demonstration, not at a social event. And the most egregious was a policy that said that the students had to leave out of the back door. And that was something that the Black and Latino Greeks had chafed under for years, at least 10 years that I know of, and had met with the administration many times, and there had been no resolution of. And part of the building the movement on the campus is we run for student government, and in part, obviously, we run as the Defend Affirmative Action Party and stand on the defense of affirmative action, and we have won consistently every single semester, multiple seats on the student government, and obviously as minority students, we are not numerically strong enough at U of M to elect ourselves to student government, so obviously there is broad white support for affirmative action at U of M, kind of if you wanted just a kind of barometer, that's one. And we raised it as a resolution saying this policy must end now. And the student government hearing was a kind of open hearing on it, and the administration was there defending the policy, saying it wasn't so, that it didn't really happen that way. And then we had white students saying, we never have wristbands, we've never left out the back door, and we don't have police on the dance floor. We had minority students talking about both what happens and what it feels like to be treated as second-class citizens on your own campus, and had almost one abstention, a unanimous resolution condemning the policy, and we called a boycott the next day. And the boycott was a one-day boycott, and we had picket lines up outside, but it wasn't like there were that many that you couldn't get through. We really had to talk to people, and we'd tell them what was going on. Most students didn't know. They'd read it in the paper for the first time. It's a majority white campus, obviously, and a lot of students would thank us. And we were like, oh, no, thank you. And they're like, no, really, thank you. And there was a consistency to that attitude that kind of made me think about it throughout the day. And by the end of the day, it was clear that there were white students who considered themselves to be against racism, had never had a chance to act on it, and were really grateful. And it was not anything I had ever experienced before. And it was clear that, and there was literally a handful of people who went through the doors. And it was a total success. The next day, the university put an editorial in the paper saying they were ending the policy, and that they didn't mean for it to be discriminatory, but clearly there were problems with it. And just that victory alone, for students to feel like they could stand up together, make an integrated fight, for Black and minority students to feel like, yes, there are white students who will stand with them, and also that if we fight together, we can actually change things, really meant, okay, what is defending affirmative action and fighting for integration and equality? It made it much more real. We're not just saying we're defending the University of Michigan's narrow affirmative action admissions policy. We're saying everything about the admissions process, everything about your experience on these campuses, everything about all of it, the level of inequality and bias that's there, that's what we're fighting around, the whole thing. And I think it's in part kind of how we've been able to build the movement and make it actually mean something, make it actually something that is popular, that people do want to become a part of, and it really is really exciting. I mean, it's anyway. And the other campaign that I'll just say briefly was a campaign to reverse a 5-year drop in minority enrollment, because obviously we are the student co-defendants defending the University of Michigan's affirmative action policy, but in part we are independent because we needed to be in order to be able to fight through the kind of things that I'm saying, the kind of racism on the campus or the conditions of the Detroit public schools. We can't be tied to this or that particular interest if we're going to be able to make our fight in an effective way. And so at the same time the University of Michigan was defending its affirmative action policy, there was a consistent every year a drop in minority enrollment, so that the last year, not 2 years ago now, there was a drop that was a 10% drop in incoming black freshmen, which is about 200 students. Now that was quite dramatic and quite drastic. And that was something that we really had to draw the line on and say, no, you can't, your deeds have to match your words. There has to be some consistency here. And we did a petition campaign and demonstrations, and the petition was very popular. Professors brought us into their classes and had us, pass it around, and they weren't out there and demonstrating, but they supported it in the ways that they could. And we would petition in every public place we could. And the petition said, essentially, we deplore this 5-year drop in minority enrollment. We call for an increase in admissions, retention, and outreach programs for underrepresented minority students. Now, and I'll preface this by saying our position is not that we have to use words that are different from affirmative action, or that we can't say that we are for affirmative action. We think that we must say that we defend affirmative action and then explain what it is. But the petition itself said nothing about affirmative action except that it was signed by the affirmative action groups. And we had many students signing it saying, oh, I'll sign this, but I'm against affirmative action. And you'd be like, okay, well, that is affirmative action. That is exactly what affirmative action is. And it gave us a chance to really go through with that. We got 8,632 signatures. And it gave us a chance to get a real pulse of the student body as to where students really stand. And it really confirmed our assumption that the majority of, majority is a strong word, but coming out of the civil rights movement in this society, the majority of white people consider themselves to be against racism in some kind of a way and for equality. But what that means exactly is not completely clear, and what that means you do is not completely clear. But if you are prepared to explain and really fight these issues through, you can get them to stand on the right page. And so we forced the university to reverse that 5-year drop, and when our case, the judge in the we've gone through a trial, which the judge ruled against us. When he ruled against us, saying diversity is not a compelling state interest, it's not important, 2 days later, we got 3,000 students out demonstrating, denouncing the judge's decision. And it meant that we could organize thousands of students out down to the demonstration in Cincinnati when our case was heard on December 6th. And that petition that we turned in supporting affirmative action, we got over 50,000 signatures on it, including the Congressional Black Caucus and the Latino Caucus and the Progressive Caucus. And the judges there were 700 tickets issued for the Court of Appeals hearing, and they opened up 3 overflow rooms because clearly the question is popular, and our case is on the way to the Supreme Court. It will be heard there, and in part what we're trying to do is frame the question for the Supreme Court, saying, okay, the way your decision is going to be seen, if you rule against affirmative action, you are going to be seen as ruling for racism, for the continuation of inequality, for the continuation of inequality in education, in society, and that is the way a decision, a negative decision on your part in front of the Supreme Court is going to be seen by this society. And we're doing a mass march on Washington when our case is heard. We're doing a petition campaign, and we're doing a conference in Memorial Day weekend at the University of Michigan Law School to basically organize around these things. And there are 2 other BAM organizers here, Tiffany and Tanya. If you could just raise your hands. If people want to talk to us afterwards, we're definitely would love to. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists for providing us with quite a bit of food for thought. And in the interest of time, we want to open it up now for questions from you, the audience. I ask that each of you, before you ask a question, just introduce yourself and also tell us your affiliation. And if you have a question you want to direct to a particular person, just say that in general, or we'll take turns answering the question. So we'll take the first question, and there are microphones right around. Go ahead.
How are you doing? My name is Edmund Wang. I'm a MPP2 at the Kennedy School of Government. And my question is actually directed to the person who is a member of BAM. When I was at Berkeley about 4 years ago, we actually remember BAM as being the leading sectarians on campus. In terms of people of color who are trying to organize, we found that their efforts were actually distracting and occurred to be too strident. And when we organized the rally of 8,000 people on Sproul Plaza, we found people who are too focused on the sectarian and particularly socialist and in terms of other non-related issues to affirmative action and civil rights to be, I guess, subtracting from our overall efforts. And my question to you, therefore, is do you wonder at any point that your strategy is something that is too dispersed and almost too decentralizing or destabilizing by pushing for overly militant as opposed to substantive struggle for civil rights and particularly preservation of race-based policies, diversity in either higher education or in general government policy? Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll start by saying we are seen as radical because what our premise is goes against the grain right now. I mean, 4 years ago, I don't know what year it was, but I'll speak on California in a second, but the Piscataway, there was a case in New Jersey, an affirmative action case called Piscataway, that the NAACP fought very, very hard and successfully kept out of the Supreme Court. And the kind of ruling wisdom at that time was there's no way that we can win a case in front of the Supreme Court on affirmative action, and we have to do everything in our power to make sure it doesn't go up there so that we don't lose. Okay, well, in 1954, the condition was not much better. It was a majority segregationist court with someone who had been in the KKK at one point in his life on that court, and Jim Crow was the legal standard. Yet there was a movement that was built and growing, and it was clearly becoming more popular, and the Supreme Court didn't feel like it could stand on Jim Crow and maintain its legitimacy. And the people who were challenging Jim Crow were seen as very, very radical, and it was a kind of not the most popular thing at the time to be a part of. And in part, okay, that's true for us. Defending affirmative action in California, when the attack was made at the point that the Democrats refused to do anything and to fight around it. I mean, when Proposition 209 came out, there were unions that sent out their bulletins that did not list 209 as one of the things to even know about or vote against. And so for BAM to be saying on the basis that we're forming to defend affirmative action, that was kind of like, oh, no, like affirmative action is dead and we have to find these other ways. And our whole premise has been radical in that we are saying, no, we think we can defend affirmative action and we think we can build a new civil rights movement. And so to say that in a chorus of people who are saying, no, we have to find these other ways and we can't take these cases to the Supreme Court, and we're saying, oh, yeah, actually now that we're being sued, we are trying to go to the Supreme Court because we do want to win on a national level and just squash this whole attack down to the ground. It is, it does rub some people the wrong way. And so in California 4 years ago, yeah, what we were saying really did go against the grain. Now, obviously, it doesn't so much. And now, for affirmative action and the NAACP, they're part of an intervention, and their youth and college division chapters have been coming out and organizing for the demonstrations. And so there's been a real shift. And so I think...
Frankly, I disagree with the idea that your notions are so radical idea about defending affirmative action directly. As in other people here at Berkeley, we had diversity in action. This was really a coalition of over 300 members, and BAM was all of 10, and they were constantly disrupting the meetings. And really, my question is, how can you focus on radical when we found your actions to be actually destructive towards real organizing?
Well, let's take another. We don't want to have to put you on the defense here with that. Certainly, obviously, there are some tensions there. Let's move to the next question. We appreciate that. Thank you.
I was a little hot.
Let's take the lady in the black and white there.
Okay, how you doing?
Hi.
It was a little tense. My name's
Yeah.
Crystal Johnson.
Yeah.
I'm a member of the Blackout Arts Collaborative, and I also run a youth program here in Cambridge. And I had two questions. One, I was listening to Professor Grenier's story about the representative, the congressional rep from Texas, and I was wondering, aside from his vote, if anyone knew, once he realized how he was being affected, how his constituents were being affected, did that transfer into other aspects of his life? Does anyone know that? And then two, for someone like me, when there's the absence of a political situation, how do we galvanize people to realize that, you know, something that affects me is going to affect you outside of the obvious way that it affects me? Because there's a lot of people that aren't here that need to understand what's going on and need to understand, you know, this philosophy of the canary and how it signals other problems. So how do I get them to kind of buy into it without a political referendum or agenda?
I'd like to respond to that part of the question, though you asked specifically something to Lonnie in terms of one of her comments. I don't know if you want to.
No, I defer.
I wanted to talk about, you know, sort of how you mobilize people in the absence of a particular issue, or as you said, there are people who are not here. And I have, in the course of my experience as an educator, done a lot of workshops on undoing racism, largely in the context of school audiences. But it's always the case, you know, when you do those, that someone will say, you know, there are people who are not here. You know, you didn't say it quite this way, but it's often the case that someone will say, well, you know, aren't you really just preaching to the choir? And, you know, what about the people who aren't here? And I always like to say in response to that, that the choir needs rehearsal, you know, and that, and what I mean by that is that, you know, when you are clear about the arguments and can articulate them clearly and then think about what's your sphere of influence, you can influence other people who may not be in the room right now, you know, but that you can get energized by the engagement, the interaction, and then think about, and I always tell my students this, to sort of think about what is my sphere of influence. Everybody has one. And some people have one that's bigger than others, and we use our spheres in different ways. You know, you talked about yourself as an artist working with young people, you know, thinking about my experience as, originally as a professor, and, you know, my students and the sphere of influence I had with them, and then thinking about the teachers who taught them, and if I influenced those teachers, it had a ripple effect, and then thinking about, well, teachers are good, but principals would be even better, you know, and then principals are good, but school superintendents are even better. I mean, you know, you can sort of start to think about not only what is your sphere of influence, but how can you expand it. And so I would just leave that as a thought in terms of thinking about how to take this conversation elsewhere.
Thank you.
Gentleman here.
I want to follow up very hard on what the gentleman from Berkeley said and put you on the spot again and say that if I had had, I don't know, some smaller percentage of the different combination of poise and level of analysis that you're bringing when I was in college, I think I'd have a lot more achievements under my belt at this point. I mean, that's just phenomenal. I'm stunned. The other thing I would say I was going to ask about is I'm a graduate student at MIT, and our department is lagging a bit in this area, in the area of diversity. And in talking with a friend of mine about these issues and trying to get at some of the nuances that you all are fleshing out, we were talking about this idea that, you know, some of these top schools, you know, we're all talking about, well, we have the best and the brightest, right? We have the best. And if you, on the one hand, have this, I'm sort of trying to see if you think that there's value in this idea. If you have this idea hypothetically that we're all really equal and, you know, little black kids are just as intelligent and smart as little white kids, and et cetera, and if you then say, well, we have the best and the brightest, but we only have this percentage of minority students, that doesn't match up. Right? It's irreconcilable. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, this is just something that, you know, a few days ago we were talking about, and I just wondered if you think there's some point of leverage there to hold up and say, well, which is it? Do you have the best and the brightest, or do you not? Or do you believe that there is a type of intellectual parity, or do you not? I mean, there has to be some So,
Yes.
Well, I think that's, that question actually gets at this fundamental association between best and brightest and SAT scores that all of us have been challenging. I think if there was a unity of assumptions among all of the panelists, it is that the SAT and the testocracy are inadequate measures of ability to perform in college and even more importantly in the world. And what you're identifying is the assumption that the best and the brightest is measured somehow by these very scores that we are challenging as a sign of wealth rather than of merit. And so what we have done in this society is basically told a story that has been told over and over again to the point that people now believe it. And that story is that the higher your SAT or the higher your LSAT, the better and the brighter you are. Now, SAT and LSAT do measure some things. They measure quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information, right? That is a virtue in some environments, right? If you are in an emergency situation, it's good to have somebody who's a strategic guesser. But assuming you have an opportunity to do research, you may want somebody who is a creative thinker, who's a problem solver. That is not what the SAT is measuring. So it's measuring one thing which we have then elevated as if that is the sole and most important measure of intelligence. Howard Gardner, Daniel Goleman, lots of people have talked about emotional intelligence, about the range of intelligences. One of the premises of this entire symposium is that there are intelligences that drive some people to become activists and some people to become scholars and some people to become artists, and they are all really important and they need to talk to each other. And we shouldn't be giving an SAT test to decide that the activists and the artists and the scholars all have to be measured by a single metric. So I think what you're identifying is the meta-narrative, as the scholar would say, that is hypocritical in terms of functional merit. But it's also hypocritical in terms of democracy and in terms of a commitment to your first question, which is that we assume that everyone is born with a certain set of potentials and aptitude that really need to be developed, and that as public institutions and as a multiracial democracy, we need to make a commitment to make sure that everyone can develop those aptitudes and those skills. And what I thought was really important and powerful about what President Tatum was saying is that Mount Holyoke, a private institution, is beginning to assume more responsibility for identifying leaders in high school, not just in college. And University of Texas is beginning to do some of that in terms of reaching out to make sure that people know about the 10% plan and that those who know about it can in fact attend. And so it's beginning to develop a very different view of what the role of the university is in a multiracial democracy, that it is not just about identifying the best and the brightest by a single metric. It is really about training leaders. And if you are going to these institutions, you have and if you are teaching at these institutions, you have an obligation to either become a leader or to help train leaders. And to do that, you have to be culturally competent. You have to be willing to take risks and to be experimental. And you have to assume some responsibility as a state institution, not just for the students who are already in your institution and not just for your graduates, although I think both of those could use greater responsibility or greater assumption of responsibility from the leadership of these institutions. But you also have to assume responsibility for the students who are not yet in your institution, but who should be.
thank you.
The gentleman here in the gray.
My name is Ryan Friedrichs. I'm a first year at the Kennedy School graduate, University of Michigan. Also.
Hi.
How you doing? My question specifically for Professor Guinier, any of the panelists, is about the Supreme Court's composition and how potential changes in that composition before the case arrives may impact the outcome, and just your thoughts as to the prospects of the case.
You said the Supreme Court's
Supreme
composition.
Court's current composition and,
Okay.
and likelihood to change and who might be coming in, et cetera.
Well, I happen to take a very different view of the Supreme Court than Caroline does. And I don't see this Supreme Court as perched to write the next Brown versus Board of Education. I disagree with her that, in fact, the court is the place to articulate the paradigm shift that John Hope Franklin is, in fact, identifying or recognizing. What I agree with her about is that the activism and the organizing that she and others are doing, that's where this paradigm shift is going to take place. It is not, the court is going to follow what is happening, but it is not going to lead, in my opinion. And I think I think there are many significant stories about Brown versus Board of Education, but the one that I want to focus on right this minute is that, unfortunately, because of the way in which we have seen Brown versus Board of Education as this historic turning point, many of us, and especially those of us who teach law, have misdiagnosed who was really responsible for Brown versus Board of Education. We've given too much credit, in my opinion, to the lawyers, and we haven't given enough credit to the organizers and to the activists who took risks so that the lawyers had plaintiffs to even bring their cases. And that sense that the lawyers are somehow the leaders continues to this very day, so that we're fixated on what the court is going to do in this Michigan case, as if that's going to send a message to the rest of the country as to what is right and wrong. I think we need to move the discussion out of the court. I want to hear about what we're doing outside of the courtroom, and I want to talk about what we can do to influence state legislatures, to influence city councils, to influence administrators, just as President Tatum was talking, to begin to experiment with ways in which we are going to challenge fundamental assumptions about merit that are not just about affirmative action. This is where I think defending affirmative action in some ways is important if we're going to do nothing else, but that it's also time to do something else. And that something else is to begin to challenge the way in which these schools are admitting everybody. Affirmative action, even when it is practiced vigorously, is only responsible for admitting between 5 and 10% of a class. What about the other 90%? What about the other 95% of the class? Why are we allowing the university to admit those students without being accountable to democratic principles? And democratic principles means that those students who are being admitted to these public institutions should be expected to give back to the society that has been subsidizing their education, so that very different criteria need to be considered that will link admissions decisions for all students, right? Not just the students of color. In some ways, what I'm saying is, whoever was concerned about Caroline being too radical, what I'm saying is more radical. Because what I'm saying is, I am not interested in just protecting a small segment of the population and its ability to get into institutions of higher education. I want a very different conversation about who deserves to go to public institutions and what we expect those people to do once they graduate. And this is about opening up those institutions to poor and working class whites, as well as poor and working class blacks and Latinos and Asians. And then, right, it's not enough just to get there. And then when they get there, we have obligations as professors to change the way in which we teach, to change our expectations of performance of all of our students, not to lower standards. I am committed to excellence, but to broaden our sense of what it is these students need to learn so that they can be leaders in the 21st century. And that means also that these students, once they graduate, have to also have a feeling that they are public citizens. They are not just there to make money. They are there to make a life for all of us better. Thank you.
Caroline, you want us to...
Yeah, I just wanted to say something. I mean, one of the The problem with the University of Michigan case is it's going to be decided. And whatever happens is going to be the case for every administration around the country, positive or negative. And so there is something really to fight over. But also what's really at stake is if we lose this case, the reason that the fight against Jim Crow, the fight for black equality, opened up the fight for women's rights, the fight for gay equality, all of these other questions was because black youth began to stand up and say, no, we will not take unequal treatment in this society any longer. And they began to fight on that premise. It was a popular premise because they were not the only people experiencing inequality in this society. So once the civil rights movement was built, and I agree, I think the Brown decision was the product of a movement, but in part, the Brown decision saying segregation is illegal now, it wasn't implemented, and it took really youth stepping up and saying, no, we don't want paper equality, we want real equality. And that kind of demand for real social equality, not just equality before the law, but real equality, was what meant that the movement broadened out, became larger, took up other issues, and became, in the end, sectoralized, and was one of the problems. Okay, but for us, the problem is the basis of the University of Michigan case is there is no longer any racism. Racism no longer exists, and therefore you don't need to take measures to offset the effects of racism. Okay, the problem with that is if we lose at the Supreme Court level, it will become illegal to take any measures to offset inequality in this society, which means at the University of Michigan we lose the Women in Science and Engineering program, because that's what happened out in the state of Washington. It means that anything that is to offset the effects of bias and inequality in this society, whether that's class, I mean, it won't be written in the decision as such, but yeah, the kind of intellectual basis of that is it will be illegal. And in part to us, that extends to everything. So in California, after they lost affirmative action, it was supposedly based on merit. They took the cap off of the GPA so that students who went to schools with, you could get 4.8 because you took AP classes. Now, students were competing against each other. I'm sorry, this is a little bit garbled, but the white students who had gone to poor schools could no longer compete to get into the school because this whole notion of merit. Okay, that was an effect of the ending of affirmative action, of the okay, so the real question is, it is a question of expansion of opportunity, but it's kind of how do we get there? And in part, we have to stand and fight where we are now and begin to fight. And in part, there's one other thing that we can look at in our own lifetimes about the Supreme Court. When the Miranda case, the question of do you have Miranda rights, was heard in front of the Supreme Court, everybody assumed that the lead judge, Rehnquist, was going to, someone who had been campaigning against Miranda rights for over 20 years, was expected to be the hatchet man on Miranda rights. It happened in the context of the presidential elections with the Gary Graham death penalty case, with Mumia Abu-Jamal's case, with the kind of scandals in the police departments in New York, Chicago, California. That was kind of all forefront news. Okay, could the Supreme Court strike down Miranda rights at that point? They didn't think so, and so the decision was 7-2 with Rehnquist dragging some other right-winger with him. Okay, nobody expected that. There wasn't a big movement, but the court is not just you take a straw poll as to what people's formal positions are at that very second. Law is a product of society. And, in part, okay, do we think it's an automatic thing that we're going to win? Absolutely not. Did anybody think that we were going to even get this far in the University of Michigan?
I just want to ask you a question about this, because let's say you're absolutely right on everything you've said, okay? Everything you've said is correct, and the Supreme Court, and the Michigan case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Michigan case says affirmative action is legal, right? It upholds affirmative action. And then schools continue to do what they are doing.
We keep building. Well, we see the problem. Our conception is different than that, because we wouldn't, if it was just defending affirmative action.
No. I'm just saying in other words, part of what I am trying to push you to do, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I just think that in some ways we have to go beyond this. I think John Hope Franklin's statement is absolutely correct. This is a moment of history, right? I agree with you on that 100%. And I think in a moment of history that it is an opportunity for all of us, and I'd really like to hear from the audience as well, as to what our vision is of a society that is democratic and just, and how are we going to get there that isn't just dependent on what the Supreme Court decides in one particular case, so that we can begin. I think you're mentioning a lot of really important points, but I would just like to move away from trying to think about or prognosticate what the Supreme Court is going to do, because I just think that's a very narrow and limiting way to have this discussion, and this is an opportunity to really talk about paradigm shifts, not to talk about tea leaves.
I'd like to speak to that, if I could, just in terms of thinking pedagogically, because I think that that's part of it, and maybe this goes back to the context of thinking about spheres of influence. You know, I mean, certainly for me, thinking as an educator, we just actually had a conference at Mount Holyoke, which was entitled In Search of Wisdom, Liberal Education for a Changing Democracy. And we invited 25 colleges and universities around the country that are small residential colleges like our own, not necessarily women's colleges, but liberal arts colleges. And the focus of that conference was to really think about how do we create learning environments that encourage what we are referring to as wise and ethical leadership for a global society. And I think it does require us to think differently about the kind of pedagogy that we are engaged in. And so I hear what I'm hearing in your question. You know, we win the case, let's say. What do we do then? You know, what's happening in the classroom? What's happening in terms of the kinds of educational experiences that students are having that gets them to think about what it means to be living or imagining a socially just society? And I think that's an important question.
Well, let's try to take some more questions. We're actually running out of time. We have about 2 more minutes left, and I want to be able to get more audience members to participate. We have the gentleman here in the purple shirt.
Hi, my name is Keith Street, and I feel like I'm a canary. And I like that analogy of the canary that's in this mine. But I wonder, like, how that canary got caught, you know, and got trapped. Whether or not that canary was taught properly by, you know, the rest of his flock, and why we keep teaching other canaries to go back into that deadly mine, because it seems like we're sitting in a mine right now, you know. And so I just wonder, you know, how we can teach the next generation how to keep from getting caught, because a lot of us are really still caught, you know. And the cage for me seems like it's more like the mind, you know, and the mind, not the mind as in M-I-N-E, but the mind as in like this mind is the cage, and the mind, the coal mine, seems more like the institutions, and we keep sending kids back into the same institutions. Why don't we establish our own institution? How do we teach the canary to stay free and keep flying?
Do you want us to answer, or are we out of time?
I want you to answer. I want one of you to certainly take his question seriously and answer. Yes.
Oh, it's serious.
Were you directing that question to anyone in particular?
Whoever can answer it.
Well, it's certainly a large question, and it's a big question, but go ahead. You wanted to say something, Caroline. I know.
Yeah, I'll say something on that, because you should say if I'm wrong, but I feel like in part you're saying is fighting for is the fight for integration necessary, and do we have to actually fight around this, or can we just? Is that true? Is that no?
That's part of it. I'll tell you. I'll give you another illustration. I was sitting with a white friend of mine yesterday. We were having lunch over on the pond, Jamaica Plain. And a flock of white birds was out on the lake, and all of a sudden this flock of blackbirds came in. I was like, man, check that out. They swooped down, boom, they hit the water, and all those blackbirds went over, stayed right there, and all the white birds stayed right there. And I said, look at that, man. I said, all those birds came down in that same spot, and they're real close. And he said, yeah, but they're not together. And I said, but they're not fighting either. You know, they're all cool. They're all in the same water. I'm not saying,
yeah.
You know.
I'll say something on that, because I feel like it's in part,
Your microphone, hold it up.
Okay, it's in part what are we fighting for? And I don't, you should say if you find this helpful or not, but in part, okay, I live in Detroit. Part of the movement that we've taken up is a fight against the Detroit School Board, which was a Republican-imposed, unelected school board against the Detroit will of the Detroit voters. And we're part of that fight. We've linked up with people in Cleveland, and we have a suit around that. But we've done demonstrations. We're at school board meetings. It's a real dogfight there, right? Because this is a real question of, do black people in the city of Detroit have the right to vote for our own school board or not, right? Okay. Detroit is segregated. Why does the state get away with giving us $6,000 per pupil, and they get away with giving Grosse Pointe, a very rich white suburb, $12,000 per pupil? They get away with that because they've segregated Detroit more and more and more, forced us to live all in one place, and then give us, inadequate everything. And in the situation where there is a real power structure that has real power, it's in part, but what is the strategy? How do you fight against them? Could Detroit win against without linking up with the suburbs? We could try, but it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a difficult fight. They've got a lot of the same issues as we do. If we link up with them, we can fight it through. But to me, that's a question of, you know what I mean? It's not just saying diversity and integration for the sake of everybody holding hands and being happy and all of nice.
But here's what they have to do.
I'm sorry, can I just finish? But Frederick Douglass said, if you build your house, if you're segregated into one area and there's a fire and all your houses are burned down, your houses are burned down. If you build your house and you're in a white area and there's black and white together, if your house catches on fire, they know their house is about to catch on fire too, and they're going to be really interested in what happens to your house. And in part, it's really, what is the basis that we're fighting on?
But see, I just wanted to take what Caroline said and connect it to what happened in Texas, and also the same situation in Pennsylvania. We assume that the alliance has to be between Detroit and its suburbs, but it turns out that the districts that are getting even less money than Detroit or Philadelphia and some of the urban areas are the rural areas, which are predominantly white. And part of the potential here is forming unlikely coalitions with poor and working class whites in rural districts, which is exactly what happened to pass the Texas 10% plan, that actually represents a very democratic recognition that these resources have to be distributed more fairly. I spoke, for example, to a black elected official in Philadelphia who said, he's been fighting, and obviously there are lots of problems in the Philadelphia schools, because the state wasn't giving Philadelphia as much money as it was giving the surrounding suburbs. But he also realized that the state was giving the rural areas of Pennsylvania even less, and that part of the challenge is to begin to find allies who actually can link their fate to a much more democratic distribution of resources. We have abdicated much of this decision-making to the suburbs, which are dominating the legislature as well as the electoral debate. And the groups that are not participating are, in fact, poor and working class whites in rural America. And the reason I think that it's important for the Canary to not only speak truth to power, but begin to speak it in a way that the minors can listen, is because right now race has been used as a single variable, which is to explain to working class and poor white people why they haven't been doing better, right? The only explanation poor and working class whites have right now for their situation is either there's something wrong with them, right? They are failures individually, or Black and Latinos have stolen the American dream. They have no language for understanding that there are patterns and decisions being made to distribute resources that don't give them the opportunity to develop. On the other hand, the Canary has an understanding, and this, for example, Michael Dawson's book, Black Visions, says 70% of African Americans believe the system is unfair to black people and also unfair to poor people. They have an analysis that says there are patterns out there that are making it hard for people like them to succeed. And so they have a language and an understanding that white people need to learn from. Agitation around race, in other words, can be a gift that black people share with working class and poor whites, to give people a vocabulary for understanding that the American dream is elusive. In 1900, 68% of the people who were among the wealthiest in the United States came from poverty. So there was this escalator effect, this sense that you could be poor and become rich. By 1970, only 4% of the wealthiest Americans came from poverty. And so this notion that if you work hard and play by the rules, somehow you too are going to get rich is not true. Black people and people of color know this because they see that the system is unfair, but working class white people don't know this, and all they have been given is the idea, well, black people and Latinos must have stolen this, and the government is giving preferences to these blacks and Latinos, and therefore what we have to do is be against preferences. And what we're saying in the Miners Canary is that we've got to bust open this conversation so that we can talk about race and do the kind of organizing that Caroline is doing, which I think is wonderful, but do it in a way that is supportive of a larger vision, that democracy needs to be accessible to all of us, and that we need to hold on to race because it is the visible language, the visible lens, and the mobilizing force that's going to help us to begin to see the way the atmosphere in the mines is poisoning not just the canary, but the miners. And Beverly wanted to say one last thing.
Well, actually, I had a different take on the question. And my take on the question was, should we enter the mine in the first place? Which is what I heard you asking. And the question that I heard you asking was, I'm in a mine, should I be here? And I think that's a decision that individuals have to make in some environments. And so the question is, should we be, trying to keep the canaries out of the mines till the air is cleared, or should we be, I guess I will speak from my perspective as an educator, that, I try to clean up the air in the space where I am, and so if that is, and I think that would be helpful to the canaries who are there with me. However, there are sometimes choices that parents and students make about which mines they're willing to enter. And I think that is a question that we have, speaking now as a parent, of two children who have been educated in some environments more positive than others, I have thought very carefully about which ones of these, which of these mines is least toxic. And and if there are places to identify that are not only not toxic, but health-inducing, we certainly want to seek those out and create them.
And on that note, I'm going to have to take over my role as moderator and actually wrap it up. We've run over time. But before I do that, let's just give our panelists one last hand.
As our moderator.
I have a couple of church announcements, school announcements before we move on to the next panel. First of all, I'm asked to announce that copies of the Miners Canary are for sale in the IOP conference room, and both Professors Grenier and Torres will sign books at 7 p.m. tonight. So please do go if you'd like to get your books signed and autographed by them. Secondly, before we move to the next panel, which is scheduled in about 5 minutes, there is a snack available behind the stage before that start of the panel, and we do hope that many of you will stay around for the second part, which should be as exciting. Thank you.
Oh, who's qualified?
Okay. I was wondering,
Speak and press.